The Battle of Pusan perimeter was a large-scale battle between United Nations and North Korean forces lasting from August 4 to September 18, 1950. It was one of the first major engagements of the Korean War. An army of 140,000 UN troops, having been pushed to the brink of defeat, were rallied to make a final stand against the invading North Korean army. 98,000 men strong. UN forces, having been repeatedly defeated by the advancing North Koreans, were forced back to the Pusan perimeter, a 140-mile defensive line around an area on the southeastern tip of the Korean peninsula that included the port of Pusan. The UN troops, consisting mostly of forces from the Republic of Korea, United States and United Kingdom, mounted a last stand around the perimeter, fighting off repeated North Korean attacks for 6 weeks as they were engaged around the cities of Taregу, Masan, and Pyeong, and the Naktong River. The massive North Korean assaults were unsuccessful in forcing the United Nations troops back further from the perimeter. Despite two major pushes in August and September, North Korean troops, hampered by supply shortages and massive losses, continually staged attacks on UN forces in an attempt to penetrate the perimeter and collapse the line. However, the UN used the port to amass an overwhelming advantage in troops, equipment, and logistics, and its Navy and Air forces remained unchallenged by the North Koreans during the fight. After 6 weeks, the North Korean force collapsed and retreated in defeat after the UN force launched a counterattack at Incheon on September 15. The battle would be the furthest the North Korean troops would advance in the war, as subsequent fighting ground the war into a stalemate. Background: outbreak of war. Following the outbreak of the Korean War, the United Nations decided to commit troops in support of the Republic of Korea, which had been invaded by the neighboring Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The United States subsequently sent ground forces to the Korean peninsula with the goal of fighting back the North Korean invasion and to prevent South Korea from collapsing. However, U.S. forces in the Far East had been steadily decreasing since the end of World War II, 5 years earlier, and at the time the closest forces were the 24th Infantry Division of the 8th United States Army, which was headquartered in Japan. The division was under strength, and most of its equipment was antiquated due to reductions in military spending. Regardless, the 24th Infantry Division was ordered into South Korea. The 24th Infantry Division was the first U.S. unit sent into Korea with the mission to take the initial shock of North Korean advances, delaying much larger North Korean units to buy time to allow following forces to arrive. The division was consequently alone for several weeks as it attempted to delay the North Koreans, making time for the 7th Infantry Division, 25th Infantry Division, 1st Cavalry Division, and other 8th Army supporting units to move into position. Advance elements of the 24th Infantry Division were badly defeated in the Battle of Pusan on July 5, during the first battle between American and North Korean forces. For the first month after the defeat of Task Force Smith, 24th Infantry Division soldiers were repeatedly defeated and forced south by the North Korean forces' superior numbers and equipment. The regiments of the 24th Infantry Division were systematically pushed south in battles around Chokyeon, Chonan, and Pyeongtaek. The 24th Infantry Division made a final stand in the Battle of Taregong, being almost completely destroyed but delaying North Korean forces from advancing until July 20. By that time, the 8th Army's force of combat troops was roughly equal to North Korean forces attacking the region, with new UN units arriving every day. North Korean advance. Having captured Taregong, North Korean forces began surrounding the Pusan perimeter from all sides in an attempt to envelop it. The North Korean 4th Infantry Division and the North Korean 6th Infantry Division advanced south in a wide maneuver. The two divisions were coordinating to envelop the UN's left flank and were extremely spread out. They advanced on UN positions, repeatedly pushing back US and South Korean forces. In the east, the North Korean army, 89,000 men strong, had advanced into South Korea in 6 columns, catching the Republic of Korea army by surprise and completely routing it. The smaller South Korean army suffered from widespread lack of organization and equipment, and was unprepared for war. Numerically superior North Korean forces destroyed isolated resistance from the 38,000 South Korean soldiers on the front before moving steadily south. Most of South Korea's forces retreated in the face of the advance. By June 28, the North Koreans had captured South Korea's capital of Seoul, forcing the government and its shattered forces to retreat further south. Though it was steadily pushed back, South Korean forces increased their resistance further south, hoping to delay North Korean units as much as possible. North and South Korean units sparred for control of several cities, inflicting heavy casualties on one another. The ROK Army defended Yongduk fiercely before being forced back, and managed to repel North Korean forces in the Battle of Andong. In the west, U.S. forces were pushed back repeatedly before finally halting the North Korean advance. Elements of the 3rd Battalion, 29th Infantry Regiment, newly arrived in the country, were wiped out at Hadong in a coordinated ambush by North Korean forces on July 27, leaving open a pass to the Pusan area. Soon after, Chinju to the west was taken, pushing back the 19th Infantry Regiment and leaving open routes to the Pusan. U.S. units were subsequently able to defeat and push back the North Koreans on the flank in the Battle of the Nosh on August 2. Suffering mounting losses, the North Korean force on the west flank withdrew for several days to re-equip and receive reinforcements. This granted both sides several days of reprieve to prepare for the attack on the Pusan perimeter. Prelude. Terrain. The UN forces established a perimeter around the port city of Pusan throughout July and August 1950. Roughly 140 miles long, the perimeter stretched from the Korea Strait to the Sea of Japan west and north of Pusan. To the west, the perimeter was roughly outlined by the Naktong River where it curved at the city of Taray-gu, except for the southernmost 15 miles where the Naktong turned eastward after its confluence with the Nam River. The northern boundary was an irregular line that ran through the mountains from above Waiguan and Andong to Yongduk. With the exception of the Naktong Delta to the south, and the valley between Taray-gu and Pyeongdong, the terrain is extremely rough and mountainous. Northeast of Pyeongdong along the South Korean line, the terrain was especially treacherous, and movement in the region was extremely difficult. Thus, the UN established the Pusan perimeter in a location outlined by the Sea of Japan to the south and east, the Naktong River to the west, and extremely mountainous terrain to the north, using the terrain as a natural defense. However, the rough terrain also made communication difficult, particularly for the South Korean forces in the Pyeongdong area. UN forces in this region also suffered from casualties related to the heat of the summer. As the Naktong region has little vegetation and clean water, Korea suffered from a severe drought in the summer of 1950. Receiving only 5 in of rain as opposed to the normal 20 in during the months of July and August. Combined with temperatures of 105 degrees Fahrenheit, the hot and dry weather contributed to a large number of heat and exertion casualties, particularly for the unconditioned American forces. Forces involved. The North Korean People's Army forces were organized into a mechanized combined arms force of 10 divisions. Originally numbering some 90,000 well-trained and well-equipped troops in July, with hundreds of T-34 tanks. However, defensive actions by U.S. and South Korean forces had delayed the North Koreans significantly in their invasion of South Korea, costing them 58,000 of their troops and a large number of tanks. In order to recoup these losses, the North Koreans had to rely on less experienced replacements and conscripts. many of whom had been taken from the conquered regions of South Korea. During the course of the battle, the North Koreans raised a total of 13 infantry divisions and 1 armored division to the fight at Pusan perimeter. The United Nations forces were organized under the command of the United States Army. The 8th United States Army served as the headquarters component for the UN forces, and was headquartered at Taregu. Under it were 3 weak U.S. divisions. The 24th Infantry Division was brought to the country early in July, while the 1st Cavalry Division and 25th Infantry Division arrived between July 14 and 18. These forces occupied the western segment of the perimeter, along the Naktung River. The Republic of Korea Army, a force of 58,000, was organized into 2 corps and 5 divisions, from east to west. ROK 1st Corps controlled the 8th Infantry Division and Capital Divisions, while the ROK 2nd Corps controlled the 1st Division and 6th Infantry Division. A reconstituted ROK 3rd Division was placed under direct ROK Army control. Morale among the UN units was low due to the large number of defeats incurred to that point in the war. U.S. forces had suffered over 6,000 casualties over the past month, while the South Korean army had lost an estimated 70,000. Troop numbers for each side have been difficult to estimate in subsequent research. The North Korean army had around 70,000 combat troops committed to the Pusan perimeter on August 5, with most of its divisions far under strength. It likely had less than 3,000 personnel in mechanized units, and around 40 T-34 tanks at the front, due to extensive losses so far in the war. MacArthur reported 141,808 UN troops in Korea on August 4, of which 47,000 were in U.S. ground combat units and 45,000 in South Korean combat units. Thus the UN ground combat force outnumbered the North Koreans 92,000 to 70,000. UN forces had complete control of the air and sea throughout the fight as well, and U.S. Air Force and U.S. Navy elements provided support for the ground units throughout the battle virtually unopposed. Overall command of the naval force was taken by the U.S. 7th Fleet, and the bulk of the naval power provided was also from the U.S. The United Kingdom also provided a small naval task force including an aircraft carrier and several cruisers. Eventually, Australia, Canada, the Netherlands, and New Zealand provided ships as well. By the end of the battle, the 8th Army had more air support than General Omar Bradley's 12th United States Army Group in Europe during World War II. From south to northeast, the North Korean units positioned opposite the UN units were the 83rd Motorized Regiment of the 105th Armored Division and then the 6th, 4th, 3rd, 2nd, 15th, 1st, 13th, 8th, 12th, and 5th Divisions and the 766th Independent Infantry Regiment. Throughout September 1950, as the battle raged, more UN forces arrived from the US and other locations. The 2nd Infantry Division, 5th Regimental Combat Team, 1st Provisional Marine Brigade and British 27th Commonwealth Brigade arrived in Pusan later in the fighting, along with large numbers of fresh troops and equipment, including over 500 tanks. By the end of the battle, 8th Army's force had gone from 3 under-prepared divisions to 4 formations that were well-equipped and ready for war. Logistics. UN Logistics. On July 1, the U.S. Far East Command directed the 8th United States Army to assume responsibility for all logistical support of the United States and UN forces in Korea, including the ROK Army. Support for the American and South Korean armies came through the United States and Japan. The re-equipping of the ROK Army presented the UN forces with major logistical problems in July. The biggest challenge was a shortage of ammunition. Though logistics situations improved over time, ammunition was short for much of the war. Consumption of supplies differed among the various units and a lack of a previously drafted plan forced UN logisticians to create a system on the fly. Subsistence for the UN troops in Korea was among the other logistical challenges confronting the UN in the early days of the war. There were no sea rations in Korea and only a small reserve in Japan at the outbreak of the war. The Quartermaster General of the U.S. Army immediately began moving all available sea rations and 5-in-1B rations from the United States to the Far East. Field rations at first were largely World War II rations. Subsistence of the ROK troops was an equally important and difficult problem. The majority of resupply by sea was conducted by cargo ships of the U.S. Army and U.S. Navy. The massive demand for ships forced the UN to charter private ships and bring ships out of the reserve fleet to increase the number of the military vessels in service. The UN had a major advantage in its sea lift operations in that the most developed port in Korea was Pusan, which was at the southeastern tip of the peninsula. Pusan was the only port in South Korea that had dock facilities large enough to handle a sizable amount of cargo. An emergency airlift of critically needed items began almost immediately from the United States to Japan. Although it did not fly into Korea, the Military Air Transport Service, Pacific Division, expanded rapidly after the outbreak of the war. Supplies and troops were flown into airfields on the Pusan perimeter from Japan by Far East Air Forces transports. The consumption of aviation gasoline thanks to both combat and transport aircraft was so great in the early phase of the war, taxing the very limited supply available in the Far East, that it became one of the serious logistical problems. From Pusan, a good railroad system built by the Japanese and well ballasted with crushed rock and river gravel extended northward. The railroads were the backbone of the UN transportation system in Korea. The 20,000 miles of Korean vehicular roads were all of a secondary nature, as measured by American or European standards. North Korean logistics. The responsibility of the North Korean logistics was divided between the Ministry of National Defense, led by Marshal Cho Yong-gun, and the NKPA Rear Service Department, commanded by General Cho Hong-kup. The MND was mainly responsible for railroad transportation and supply procurement, while the Rear Service Department was responsible for road transportation. The North Koreans relied on a logistical system which was very lean and substantially smaller than the United Nations system. This logistics network was therefore capable of moving far fewer supplies, and this caused considerable difficulty for front-line troops. Based on the efficient Soviet model, this ground-based network relied primarily on railroads to transport supplies to the front, while troops transported those items to the individual units on foot, trucks, or carts. This second effort, though more versatile, was also a substantial disadvantage because it was less efficient and often too slow to follow the moving front-line units. In mid-July, the UN Far East Air Force Bomber Command began a steady and increasing campaign against strategic North Korean logistics targets. The first of these targets was Wonsan on the east coast. Wonsan was important as a communications center that linked Vladivostok, Siberia, with North Korea by rail and sea. From it, rail lines ran to all the North Korean build-up centers. The great bulk of Russian supplies for North Korea in the early part of the war came in at Wonsan, and from the beginning it was considered a major military target. By July 27, the FEAF Bomber Command had a comprehensive rail interdiction plan ready. This plan sought to cut the flow of North Korean troops and materiel from North Korea to the combat area. Two cut points, the Pyongyang Railroad Bridge and Marshalling Yards and the Hamhung Bridge and Hamhung and Wonsan Marshalling Yards, would almost completely sever North Korea's rail logistics network. Destruction of the rail bridges over the Han near Seoul would cut rail communication to the Pusan perimeter area. On July 28, the FEAF gave Bomber Command a list of targets in the rail interdiction program, and 2 days later a similar plan was ready for interdiction of highways. On August 4, FEAF began B-29 interdiction attacks against all key bridges north of the 37th parallel in Korea, and on August 15, light bombers and fighter bombers joined in the interdiction campaign. North Korea's lack of large airstrips and aircraft meant it conducted only minimal air resupply, mostly critical items being imported from China. Other than this, however, aircraft played almost no role in North Korean logistics. The North Koreans were also not able to effectively use sea transport. Ports in Wonsan and Hungnam could be used for the transport of some troops and supplies, but they remained far too underdeveloped to support in any large-scale logistical movements, and the port of Incheon in the south was difficult to navigate with large numbers of ships. The supremacy of the 5th Air Force in the skies over Korea forced the North Koreans in the first month of the war to resort to night movement of supplies to the battle area. They relied primarily on railroads to move supplies to the front. However, a shortage of trucks posed the most serious problem of getting supplies from the trains to individual units, forcing them to rely on carts and pack animals. The North Korea Army was able to maintain transport to its front lines over long lines of communications despite heavy and constant air attacks. The United Nations air effort failed to halt military rail transport, ammunition and motor fuel, which took precedence over all other types of supply, continued to arrive at the front, though in smaller amounts than before. At best there were rations for only 1 or 2 meals a day. Most units had to live at least partially off the South Korean populace, scavenging for food and supplies at night. By September 1, the food situation was so bad in the North Korean army at the front that most of the soldiers showed a loss of stamina with resulting impaired combat effectiveness. The inefficiency of its logistics remained a fatal weakness of the North Korean army, costing it crucial defeats after an initial success with combat forces. The North Koreans' communications and supply were not capable of exploiting a breakthrough and of supporting a continuing attack in the face of massive air, armor, and artillery fire that could be concentrated against its troops at critical points.